Chinese property developer Evergrande is collapsing, but its problems are just the tip of the iceberg. What lies under the water is the now shaky pillar of the Chinese economy, real estate. What ugly truth is the Evergrande drama revealing about China's so-called economic miracle? Does China have the tools in its arsenal to keep the growth going or prevent a crisis? And what does an at-risk economy mean for the ruling Chinese Communist Party? In this special report, we look at what Beijing still has left up its sleeve to convince the Chinese people to ignore widespread issues and human rights abuse in order to preserve the economy, and examine exactly how far this teetering domino effect could go. But first, how much trouble is Evergrande really in? Let's size it up. In the past few weeks, Evergrande's investors have been surrounding the company's headquarters, demanding their money back. The second largest real estate developer in China is drowning under a more than $300 billion bill. To understand how big that dollar amount is, that's about the same value as South Africa's entire GDP and more than Russia's total government debt. Of that $300 billion, $19 billion are in offshore bonds, meaning money from international bondholders. Many experts believe that offshore debt has even less chance of getting paid back than onshore debt if the Chinese regime was to bail Evergrande out. Those foreign bondholders include some of the world's largest asset managers in North America and Europe, as well as the Japanese government pension fund. Evergrande reportedly owes money to around 170 domestic banks and 120 other financial firms who may or may not get their money back. The property giant has currently sold over 1.5 million houses to Chinese citizens, but those properties haven't been built yet. And as for the Chinese citizens who poured their life savings into home buying with Evergrande, they may never see those houses delivered. On top of that, Evergrande directly employs over 200,000 people and provides work for 4 million others, a massive potential for job loss. So that's what's at risk. Evergrande is sinking and has already failed to make multiple debt payments. Now it's taking these factors and people down with it. Evergrande has started selling off some of its completed properties, but with big discounts. But experts warn that with cheap housing flooding the market, significant real estate price drops are looming. The scary thing is Evergrande isn't alone. There are dozens of other Chinese developers out there who are equally in trouble, already missing payments or facing looming deadlines they probably won't reach. The bankruptcy wave has already started among developers. According to a Chinese media report, as of September, 274 real estate companies have filed for bankruptcy in China. Most of them are smaller companies, but that still puts the sector at a rate of almost one bankruptcy per day. Real estate is a $5 trillion sector in China. The Chinese regime has been relying on it and its related industries to keep the economy going over the past 2 decades. Real estate accounts for nearly 30% of the Chinese economy. That's compared to just 9% of Japan's economy before the country's housing bubble burst in the 90s, and just 6% in the U.S. during the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, when the collapse of the housing bubble triggered a global financial disaster. As a result, Chinese housing prices have risen to extremely high levels, especially in major cities. According to a Chinese media report, the ratio of house prices to income was 48 in the Chinese city of Shenzhen and 30 in both Beijing and Shanghai as of last year. That's compared to 9.3 for San Francisco and 6.6 for New York. Chinese media reports say that in the Chinese city of Nanjing, an average person has to work for about 20 years in order to afford an apartment, with one caveat. In that time, the person can't pay to eat or drink or spend absolutely any money on anything else. And here's the even larger problem. The bigger and shinier a housing market bubble gets, the uglier the aftermath will be if it bursts. Many believe Beijing won't allow widespread fallout to happen in order to maintain social stability. But on the other hand, the Communist Party leader Xi Jinping seems more determined than ever to crack down on developers' borrowing frenzy. Saving these companies could look like a slap in the face. As we watch fate play out for China's housing market and economy, one question remains: how did it all begin? The Chinese economy is the envy of much of the world. That's if you listen to Wall Street or pay attention to the media, which often cites numbers given by the Chinese Communist Party. Beijing's economy has grown at record pace amid the pandemic rebound, and some data shows it could overtake the U.S. as the world's largest economy earlier than expected, as soon as 2028. That's why billionaire investor Ray Dalio is advising investors to bet on China, or else he says they'll continue to miss out. It's also why U.S. investment manager BlackRock says investors should triple their asset allocation in China, even though the regime is cracking down on private companies and tanking their stocks. And why Wall Street continues to pour investors' money, including many people's 401ks, into Chinese companies. The Chinese economy has grown a lot since joining the World Trade Organization in 2001.
If we look back on the origins of China's economic boom over the past 2 decades, there were 2 main booms: the export boom and the construction boom. Both of these booms cannot be replicated. That is to say, the economic boom of the past 20 years or so was a one-time event. It's not sustainable.
Dr. Chen Xiaonong is a U.S.-based scholar of Chinese politics and economy. In China, he worked as a policy researcher and aide to former Communist Party leader Zhao Ziyang. Joining the World Trade Organization sparked China's first decade of prosperity.
Rush to a market economy has produced an orgy of capitalism.
With the help of cheap labor costs and foreign investment, China's exports grew by nearly 25% every year and became the locomotive pushing its economic growth. Then the 2008 financial crisis came.
The 2008 crisis led to a significant reduction in China's export orders, and this marked the turning point of China's export boom.
As China's wage rises and foreign investment started to withdraw, the country's export boom began to decline in 2012. And by 2016, its exports fell by 7.7%. That slump spelled bad news for the ruling Communist Party, or CCP. That's because it relies on the economy to prove its legitimacy and to convince the Chinese people to ignore other issues like political corruption and human rights. To counter the dwindling export market, real estate came to the rescue. China soon started its borrow and build model of economic growth, driven not just by houses, but also roads, bridges, and all essential and non-essential infrastructure. In less than 10 years, real estate became the pillar of the Chinese economy. It also drove smaller booms in dozens of upstream and downstream industries.
During the height of the construction boom, it was almost unimaginable. China consumed as much cement in 3 years as the United States consumed in the entire 20th century.
That explains why so many upscale buildings seem to sparkle in major Chinese city skylines, with much newer construction than those in New York, Los Angeles, or London.
For many from other countries, all of this is a symbol of China's continuing economic prosperity. But such prosperity on the surface is actually the result of the local government's massive lending and overinvesting. The reality is that China has completed all necessary and completely unnecessary urban construction projects that are normally built over decades in just 10 years.
That kind of prosperity isn't just unsustainable, but also carries huge side effects. For one, local government branches over-reliance on real estate and their mounting debt. To understand the issue, let's first look at how property rights work in China. No one in China is allowed to own or purchase land. All land is owned by the Chinese regime, and people can only purchase the right to use the land, normally for 70 years. And amid the country's housing market surge, the degree that local governments have grown to rely on selling land use rights is staggering. According to Chinese media reports, local branches of China's government under the communist regime on average make over 56% of their revenue from selling land use rights. Those numbers get even worse in some areas. Ratios of land revenue to overall revenue in China's Jiangsu and Zhejiang provinces come in at nearly 120% and over 140% respectively. A declining housing market means developers won't pay local governments as much for land rights.